There is a specific quality of silence that follows the moment when everything stops working. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of resolution or the particular stillness that arrives when something long anticipated finally completes itself. This is a different kind of silence entirely. The silence of a system that has just run out of road. The silence that descends when the story you have been living inside, the one that explained you to yourself, that gave your suffering a shape you could navigate, that told you who you were in terms coherent enough to function, suddenly, without warning, stops being able to hold its own weight. You know this silence, not as a concept, as a memory. The moment the relationship ended in a way that foreclosed every story in which it could be repaired. The moment the version of yourself you had been building for years revealed itself. The moment the future you had been quietly, privately, organizing everything around became impossible, not difficult, not delayed, but impossible, and the entire architecture of meaning that had been suspended from that future came down with it. The moment the floor gave way. They say, it was the worst thing that ever happened to me. And then, after a pause that carries the specific weight of something that has been turned over many times in private, they say, it was also the beginning of everything that actually mattered. This is not the logic of suffering being redemptive. Suffering is not inherently redemptive. It is not instructive by nature. It does not automatically produce growth or insight, or the transformation that retrospective narratives tend to organize themselves around. Most suffering simply hurts. Most loss is simply loss. It's the mythology of the necessary wound. The idea that breakdown is always secretly breakthrough, that the darkest moment always precedes the dawn, is a story the mind tells afterward to make the unbearable feel purposeful. What is true is something more specific than that mythology, and considerably more interesting. The default mode network is one of the most studied structures in contemporary neuroscience. It is the brain's narrative system, the network responsible for self-referential thought, autobiographical memory, the continuous generation of the story of who you are in relation to where you have been and where you are going. It is active when you are not actively focused on a task. It is the voice that narrates, the one that contextualizes. It's the one that takes the raw material of experience and weaves it continuously into the coherent thread of a self moving through time. It is also, in most people, almost never quiet. Researchers studying the default mode network have noted something that sounds simple but carries profound implications. The network's activity is closely correlated with a quality of experience that most people, when asked to locate it, describe as the sense of being inside their own head. It's the sense of distance from immediate experience. It's the sense of the present moment being filtered through a layer of commentary, evaluation, anticipation, and retrospection. The sense, familiar to virtually everyone who has tried to simply be present, that there is always something between you and the actual texture of what is happening right now. The default mode network is that something. And under ordinary circumstances, circumstances of relative psychological stability, of narrative coherence, of a self-concept that is more or less intact and more or less functional, it runs continuously. It's generating story, maintaining identity. It's doing the work of keeping the self coherent across time in a way that allows the person to function, but under conditions of sufficient disruption. Conditions that exceed the narrative system's capacity to immediately integrate what is happening into the existing story. Something else occurs. The network quiets, not permanently, not voluntarily, not through any spiritual achievement or meditative sophistication, simply because the disruption has exceeded the system's processing capacity, and the story generation machinery has, temporarily, run out of material. And in that quiet, in that brief, involuntary suspension of the continuous self-narrative, the observing consciousness that was always behind the narrative becomes, suddenly, accessible, not as a concept, a direct experience. This is the neurological mechanism behind what people describe when they say that their crisis changed them in ways that years of intentional work had not. It is not that the suffering taught them something. It is that the suffering temporarily interrupted the system that had been preventing them from seeing what was already there. The Watcher did not arrive during the crisis. The Watcher was revealed by it. There is a difference that matters enormously for understanding why genuine transformation so rarely follows a linear path of accumulating insight, and so often arrives instead through disruption, through loss, through the specific quality of psychic pressure that forces the narrative system past its own threshold. You cannot think your way to the observing self. You cannot will yourself there, cannot achieve it through sufficient dedication to the project of self-improvement, cannot produce it by accumulating enough understanding about your own psychology, because the very apparatus you would use to think your way there, the narrative-generating, self-referential, autobiographical story machine, is precisely what stands between ordinary consciousness and the witnessing function. The door is not locked from the outside, it is papered over from the inside. With everything you know about yourself, now, let us talk about what actually happens in the gap. Because the gap, the silence between the collapse of one story and the construction of the next, is not empty. It only appears empty from the perspective of the narrative system, which registers its own absence as a kind of void. It's the terrifying blankness that crisis survivors describe as the worst part. Worse, sometimes, than the pain itself. The not knowing, the groundlessness. The loss of the familiar orientations that told you who you were, what things meant, what came next. But the groundlessness is not the truth of the gap. What the gap actually contains, what becomes accessible in that suspension, briefly and often without the person having any framework for what they are contacting, is the awareness that was always behind the story. People describe it in different ways because language, built as it is from the architecture of the narrative self, is imprecisely suited to describe what is encountered when the narrative self is temporarily offline. They describe a quality of presence that felt more real than ordinary reality, a stillness that was not numbness. A sense of being underneath everything that had just collapsed, somehow, inexplicably, almost offensively, given the circumstances, intact, not okay, not healed, i.e., not in any way relieved of the specific weight of what had just happened, but intact, present, witnessing, unbroken, at some level that the breaking had not reached. That is the Watcher making contact, not as concept, or as practice, or as the product of any intentional cultivation. It's the irreducible thing that remains when everything constructed has been stripped away. Post-traumatic growth research, the body of work examining why some people emerge from devastating experiences with a fundamental expansion of psychological capacity, rather than simply the accumulation of damage. It's consistently pointed toward a cluster of features that predict transformation rather than mere survival, not the severity of the disruption. Severity alone predicts nothing good, not the person's psychological sophistication before the event. Prior self-knowledge, while useful in many contexts, is not the primary predictor of whether crisis produces growth. What the research points toward, consistently and across widely different populations and widely different categories of loss, is something more experiential than either of those. A quality of relationship to the experience itself. A capacity to remain present to what is happening without immediately recruiting the full force of the psychological defense system to make it stop, to make it mean something manageable, to collapse the gap before the gap has had time to do its work. The people who are transformed by crisis, rather than simply damaged by it, are, in some important sense, the people who stayed in the gap long enough, not by choice, necessarily, not through some superior capacity for tolerating uncertainty, sometimes simply because the defense system was overwhelmed enough. The narrative system disrupted enough that the usual mechanisms for premature closure were temporarily unavailable. And in that involuntary staying, in that enforced residence in the groundlessness, something contacted them that the defended, narratively occupied version of themselves had not been still enough to feel. Here is where the territory requires the most care. Because everything described so far could be read as an argument for the necessity of suffering. It's a suggestion that the path to the Watcher runs only through devastation. It's a framework that inadvertently romanticizes breakdown by positioning it as the primary mechanism of awakening. That reading would be incomplete. And for some people listening to this, people who have already endured more than enough disruption, who have already been cracked open more times than transformation would seem to require, it would also be unkind. So let's be precise. Crisis does not produce the Watcher. It reveals it, it. And the specific mechanism by which it does so, the temporary interruption of the narrative system, the involuntary quieting of the default mode network's continuous story generation, is not exclusive to crisis. It's accessible through other routes. The dedicated contemplative practice that gradually, over time, creates the conditions for the narrative system to quiet voluntarily rather than under duress. It's the creative state that absorbs enough of the narrative apparatus that the witness becomes briefly perceptible through the absorption. It's the particular quality of presence that sometimes arrives in deep conversation. It's the moment when two people are in enough genuine contact that the performance drops and something more direct becomes possible. It's even this, what is happening right now, in this listening, can function as an aperture. Not because the content is transformative in the informational sense, but because the quality of attention that genuine recognition produces, the specific state of a mind that has encountered something true and is, for the moment, too busy recognizing it to narrate it, creates, briefly, exactly the kind of quieting in which the Watcher becomes perceptible. You may have felt it already. In a moment during the opening sequence, when something landed before you could evaluate it. In a pause between sections where the narration stopped and something continued. In the strange sensation, familiar to anyone who has ever encountered something that was already known before it, was heard of recognition arriving before understanding. That sensation, that is not a response to the content. That is the Watcher recognizing itself. But there is a shadow to all of this. And it would be a different kind of dishonesty to describe the moment the Watcher wakes without also describing what can happen to the awakening when it occurs in a psyche that has not yet developed the capacity to hold it. Because the observing consciousness, the witnessing function, the part that stands behind experience and perceives without being destroyed by what it perceives, can be recruited. In the absence of integration, into the service of a defense that looks almost identical to it from the outside. Dissociation. The experience of watching your own life from outside it, of being the perpetual observer. It's never quite fully inside anything, always slightly removed from the full contact of your own experience, is, in its phenomenology, remarkably similar to the witnessing function, attains the same quality of not being entirely inside the feeling, sprying the same sense of the self as separate from its own contents. The same apparent stillness in circumstances that would normally produce disturbance. But the origin is entirely different. And the direction is entirely opposite. The Watcher emerges toward experience, moving into fuller contact with the reality of what is, from a position of stability that makes that contact possible without it being overwhelming. Dissociation moves away from experience, retreating from the full weight of what is, into a watching position that functions as distance, as protection, as the psyche's last resort mechanism for surviving what it cannot otherwise metabolize. One is expansion. The other is contraction wearing expansion's face. And for people whose earliest experiences taught them that full presence was not safe, that being completely inside their own experience was dangerous, that the watching position was the only position from which survival was possible. The distinction between these two states is not always immediately clear from the inside. This is the shadow of awakening, the possibility that what feels like the watcher is actually the wound, that what presents as consciousness expanding is actually consciousness contracting around a very old, very understandable, very human need to not be hurt again. The way you know the difference is not through analysis. It is through contact. The watcher, when genuinely active, does not produce distance from life. It produces a quality of presence that makes fuller contact with life possible, because the stability of the witnessing position allows the experiencing self to feel more, not less, to move more deeply into the full dimensionality of what is actually happening, because there is now something behind the experience that can hold its full weight without being destroyed. Dissociation, however calm it appears on the surface, produces a specific kind of hollowness, quality of watching that is accompanied, somewhere below the watching, by a low frequency of something unmet, something that is waiting behind the distance to be felt. Not the stillness of the watcher, which requires nothing, waits for nothing, is complete in itself, but the stillness of a system that has gone quiet, because going quiet was the only way it knew how to survive. One watching is full, there is empty, and with time, with the particular quality of honest attention that this work requires, the difference becomes unmistakable. What cracks you open is not always what destroys you. In the silence on the other side of the breaking, the groundlessness, the not knowing, the terrible freedom of a self whose story has finally run out of road, that silence is not the absence of something. It is the presence of the only thing that was never constructed, the only thing that could not be lost, because it was never, not once, the thing that was falling.